Okay, so here's a pretty weedy area, and here's how I work on controlling it. Periodically I come along with my Japanese sickle, sometimes called a kama, and just cut everything back. And what I have right here is a really big example of a sweet clover, Mellolotus alba. And nitrogen fixing, great taproot. And so it's got a lot of root matter that's under the ground, and that root matter is going to decay and leave me lots of root channels down in the ground. So I just cut that off, and I can just cut back this weeds right here. And there's several things I can do with the weeds. There's a bunch of raspberries in there too, so yeah, I can get some pretty big bunches of weeds here. This is all mulch. This is all going to feed the soil. Got a spruce tree here. Here's another spruce tree. Here's a row of elecampane, herbal root, and here's some yucca plants. Here's some motherwort going to seed, medicinal herb motherwort, and this is blue elderberry, and it's dying back from the fall here. So I've got long-term perennials, trees and shrubs, weeds, and crop plant here. I haven't been back here in weeks. It sort of is taking care of itself, growing fertilizer, making organic matter, adding to the biomass. Here's amur cork tree, amur philodendron amurensis, and it's a medicinal bark. I got a few of them in here next to the raspberries. Here's some sand cherries, which is a great bearing cherry tree. Back here is here's an alder, nitrogen fixing native, and I can just sort of work my way in through here. Here's buffaloberry, silver buffaloberry mixed in here as a berry crop. These are gooseberries here. Here's a mugwort plant which has been spreading in here. So a lot of times I like to cut my mulch and just let it drop right where it is. So it's sort of like a cut and drop system. So I just cut my way through here periodically and cut the weeds and let them lay on the ground. So you'll see there's quite a bit of organic matter under here. Okay, here's another weedy spot. We'll just show you this one. So I haven't weeded this all year long, so it's kind of piled up in here. I can just cut back some of these weeds here so we can see what we got going. Okay, so here's a blue elderberry, and that's going to have to come out next year anyway, so we'll prune that back a bit. Here's a row of Siberian tree shrubs, nitrogen fixing, more weeds growing in among it. See, weeds, when I get into this long-term perennial stuff, like these trees and shrubs, it doesn't matter that the weeds cause them no problem. In fact, they're only going to be a benefit to the planting. And here's what I do with my crop waste and weeds. This is weeds and crop waste from last year. I pile them up in piles. This is actually, there's even some raspberry canes here, but I have deep organic matter here. It goes all the way down this row of trees, shrubs in between them. And so this is a long-term biomass storage in the place. And having some big weeds growing here just adds to the diversity of the flora, the fauna, and what feeds the insects. So my garden is alive with insects, and that means it's alive with birds. And these weeds make a lot of seeds too. And so the quail live here and various seed-eating birds too. So the weeds are very multifunctional. They're cash, they're helping aerate the soil, they're adding biomass, they're feeding fuel into the soil, they're feeding the web of life, they're feeding the insects are feeding the birds, they're feeding the worms. So the having herbs and weeds in a controlled situation is really beneficial. Where I don't want it is in my first year cropping, when things are getting established. I let the weeds happen in years 2 and 3. In year 1, I have virtually no weeds because I want really good establishment of my long-term perennials. One of our permaculture principles is to put lots of perennials in most systems. But we still have annual gardens here too. So before, this was just a windswept field, just flat as a pancake, and now I'm getting quite a bit of height here, and this is its 3rd year. So every year this is going to get denser and wilder, and so pretty soon it's going to look more wild than tame. So any rate, weeds help the wildness also. Hey, volunteer parsnips. Last year I had a 7-pound parsnip seed harvest from a row of parsnip here. I let of course a lot of them fell on the ground, so now I've got this little forest of parsnips here. And so I'm going to get parsnips, and then if you look down this row here, let's dig one of these guys up, see if they're worth anything yet. This is some elecampane root. That again, it's a medicinal herb. I grow the root, and then some of it goes to seed, and I let the seed grow. So again, part of my weed flora has elecampane. And there's a decent little elecampane root. I probably got a pound of root here, or a half pound maybe. But if you look down the row, there's a lot of elecampane seedlings here. So part of my yield here, you know, this is the pathway. It's got weeds in it. Here's catnip for a weed. Here's the dandelion. I got a lot of dandelion weeds in here. Nice section, particularly nice big ones here. Let's see what this one looks like. Yeah, it's actually not that big. I grow really big dandelions in some places, but they add up. So I've got dandelion, elecampane, and catnip, all of which are income producing as weeds. And I've got things like this weed I don't particularly like, sow thistle. Here's wild lettuce. Here's a weed I really do like. This is alfalfa. It's a crop if I take the time to harvest it, but mostly it's just a nitrogen fixer. So I can just come along and slash these weeds and let them lay around in here.
Chop and drop?
Chop and drop, yep, that's right. That's a good term for it. Chop and drop as the weed method. And here's weeds growing in amongst the currant bushes. Currants didn't look too good right now, but they got some kind of leaf curl. But next year they should come out and do really well. More elecampane and dandelion mainly. Some mustard, horseweed, wild lettuce. So you can see it's just chop and drop. But this is the pathway here. Look at there's down here. There's the several weeds worth of mulching here. So it's all protecting the soil. And I really like this. The weed in the rows between the perennials. See, here's amur cork tree. Another tree, a Siberian pea shrub. Here's our thick mulch pile again. So one of my goals in my garden is just to really improve the carbon storage. So before, this was just a tomato field. It had very little carbon in the soil, but the roots, this is a lot of root matter down there. And all this above ground biomass you see, this is all carbon based. These weeds, these trees, here's a native hawthorn. Everything's dying back for the winter, but this will be a forest someday. Down here is a mulberry section. We'll have mulberry. And here the weeds have just basically grown for the year and they're died. And by next spring I'll slash it all down so it's can start over again. They quite call it a polyculture, I guess, depending on what you want to define polyculture as.
Well, rather than growing great big rows, I see that you've got patches. You'll have small, really small patches.
Right, it's partly rows and partly patches. Some things lend themselves to patches, like the peppermint over there is just one big mass of peppermint. It spreads. My arnica bed over here just spreads. This meadowsweet here, it's just going to stay in one spot. It's going to stay a row here. They just get bigger every year. And then right in back of it here is black cohosh. Here's some seed heads of the black cohosh. And that's going to stay put. I don't get a harvest for 4 years. Meadowsweet I'll get a harvest next year. This is Culver's root. I'll get a, that's a 4 year to harvest. Down here's beans. Here's a bean plant. We got green beans earlier. Now we're just going to pull off the dried beans. There's squash running around in here. And then there's some beets growing in here as well. We got some humongous beets here. And here's some of the weeds. You know, here's our lamb's quarter weed. Here's a clover, nitrogen fixing weed. Here's an arugula as a weed. We have a lot of arugula volunteers. See, here's the arugula flower. I can still eat that. So there's a lot of weeds in this area, you'll see, intermixed with herb crops. So this area has kind of gotten away from me a little bit, but you could call it a polyculture. If you want to say polyculture is a lot of species living in close proximity, then we could call it a polyculture, but there's little patches of things in here all over the place. So the goal of monoculture farmers, industrial farmers, is to grow as many acres of one crop as possible. The 1,000-acre wheat farm. That's their goal. My goal is to grow 100 crops on 1 acre. That's much more diverse, so we're diversiculture. 100 crops on 1 acre, or maybe even up to 500 crops on 1 acre. But 100 is pretty good.
But even though you've got 0.85 acres here, I know this is like not your only squash patch. You've got, I don't know, what have you got, like a dozen squash patches instead of one big squash patch?
5 squash patches this year, but you know, mostly they're big all together. You know, I like squash all in once. I like big areas of squash, but in my squash patches, trees and shrubs grow out of it because they're interspersed with it in general. So you'll so diversity of spots, diversity in crops. The more things you stick together, usually the less problem you have with diseases and insects. Here, might as well pick some more beets here. So it becomes a bit like wildcrafting here, because there's just food all over the place. Here's beans, squash, and beets all growing together. So it's nice having this diversity of crops.